Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, our analyses of each of the poems of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now starting from Paumanok, section number 12 out of the 19 sections of Paumanok. Now, this is one of the longer sections for us to study, and I want us to pay attention to the continuation from section 11 to 12 and the song bird and the mockingbird that was mentioned in 11, and now how we're going to see something here continued in 12. In many ways, put this in your notes, this is our discussion of Whitman's Theodicy, T-H-E-O-D-I-C-Y. Now, the assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side there, find our Talks with Walt, as we're calling these lectures. And my assumption is that you've been working with us through the 24 poems of inscriptions, that introductory set of poems, and then as well that you've been working with us from the introductory lecture. I'm starting from Paumanok through lecture number 11. Especially for this set of comments, I hope that you've paid attention to section number 6 and those some 16 I wills, I will that's repeated. We're going to get 13 of those here in this. That is to say, the intentionality of the poet. Okay, now in those introductory lectures we pointed out what we call our big five in room 303. What does this text say about epistemology, what you can know? The fallibilist position especially, that is to say about knowledge, I think I'm right but I could be wrong. Ontology and who we are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective mind. And then finally, our last of our big five is the question of theodicy. Why is it that bad things seem to happen? And when bad things happen, our inclination is to ask, why did this happen to me? Instead of what Whitman will argue, why did this happen for me? Now, as we turn to section 12, because it's so long, I like to normally read the entire poem section with you and then come back to exegete. My assumption in all of these is, again, that you are working with your own reading and then coming back to work with me. Now, just to remember, we will finish 11, passage 11, with his walking in Alabama, a place apparently we don't think he ever actually went. But then we'll begin with the word democracy and an exclamation point, and this will immediately take us, right, to passage 10, where we got those three greatnesses, those three greatest of the greats. That is to say, the center of Leaves of Grass is in fact love, democracy, religion, and so here we are with democracy. So in many ways, we're going to be messing around with Whitman as politician, his love of democracy, and as well as Whitman as philosopher and his question about theodicy. Democracy. Then he says it. Near at hand to you, a throat is now inflating itself and joyfully singing. And of course, this is a direct line from passage 11 when he's talking about pausing with the song bird, the mockingbird singing, and the throat is inflating. Notice this poem begins by speaking directly to democracy. So mafam is the next word, and this is how Whitman will often address democracy in 1860. He'll do it, for example, in For You, O Democracy, as well as France, the 18th Year of the States, both texts that we're going to obviously work with. Mafam, and then notice it's another exclamation point. In other words, that which is most sacred. Notice how that his three essentials, democracy, love, and religion, all intertwine in fascinating ways. Then he comes back to the image of the brood, which is in third line of section 11. The mockingbird in the nest, in the briars, hatching her brood. And now here, notice, democracy's brood is beyond us, and again we're back to the issue of being beyond in passage 11. Beyond us and of us, right? In other words, there's something transcendent about democracy, and yet we're all engaged in it. And for Whitman, that tension between those two things is foundational to his writing of Leaves of Grass, and obviously our capacity to understand Leaves of Grass. For those who belong here, and those to come, you immediately think of poets to come, right? I exalt, one of the key phrases in Leaves of Grass. To be ready for them will now shake out carols. This shakeout is a fascinating kind of word picture. We're going to see this. It's almost like shaking out hair or shaking out a tree, or, you know, in terms of imagery, we've got that idea of the fierce maenads of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. Go back and look at that lecture and the way in which Shelley talks about that in The Power of the Clouds. I shake out carols. Sometimes he calls them songs, sometimes he calls them poems, sometimes he calls them chants. Here he calls them carols. Stronger, we immediately think of our Milton and things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And haughtier. Now this is a key word. We don't want to think of this word necessarily as conceited as much as haughty here means confident. For Whitman, one of the things he loves about America and democracy is the confidence that Americans have. I hear America singing, one of our inscriptions poems from earlier, obviously. Haughtier than ever yet been heard upon earth. Now, Virgil, of course, would have rolled his eyes at something like this. Dude, you can't come up with anything much more haughty than the poem that I wrote in celebration of great Caesar in the Aeneid. And yet, notice here, Whitman is saying, I'm going to do something better than anything Homer or Virgil ever did, something even better than what Milton did in Paradise Lost, or even Dante did in the Divine Comedy. Or, I'm going to assume all of those and everything that came before produces this brood, this democratic understanding. Notice, when he starts talking about democracy, and we as Americans and readers of this poem, it's hard to distinguish that from his own poems themselves. Then he goes on a run, very much like passage number 6 with this I will, I will, I will. The intentionality is important. And then the other thing I want to point out is his use of the word show. We say great writers show don't tell, and here we're going to watch some of this. I will make the songs of passion to give them their way. Now this word passion we're going to pay attention to because it's going to be a central one to the Leaves of Grass, no question. And your songs outlawed, did you notice that it is again the elided verbs as we talked about earlier, to make that American vernacular more powerful. And your songs outlawed offenders. For I scan you with kindred eyes and carry you with me the same as any. The poet of the downcast, the poet of the rejected, the poet of the offenders. Whitman always wanting to take all sides in the issues. I will make the true poem of riches. Ironically, Whitman was always poor. He never actually got wealthy. By the end of his life, they had some small amount of means, but nothing like he ever became the incredibly wealthy artist, poet that obviously he should have been, given the amazing work he was doing. To earn for the body and the mind whatever adheres and goes forward, and is not dropped by death. In other words, I'm interested in the things that transcend death itself. Now we're going to get to this issue of death, so just note that we're already... Whitman's dancing with death and the concept of death is central to reading Leaves of Grass, and I think this is especially true. We'll save much of our comments here until later, but this is especially true after his experience of the Civil War, where he served as a nurse helping, of course, so many wounded soldiers for both the North as well as the Confederacy. I will, he says, effuse, that word, that urging, that procreant kind of urging. I will effuse, and then he uses the word egotism. Now, for those of you who follow your Ayn Rand, the Atlas Shrugged text, Fountainhead, as well as the objectivist types of things, there's a distinction that Rand will make between egotism and egoism, right? And I'll let you run that one to ground. But here, notice it is egotism, and we're back to this haughty thing. When Whitman uses this idea, it is, in fact, about confidence. And, of course, a recognition that there's more than oneself as we get to the whole notion of the ego, right? Obviously, our Freud here comes to mind as well for us. And show it underlying all this egotism. And I will be the bard of personality. And, of course, Whitman, if he's anything, and he's a whole lot of things, but if he's anything, he is, of course, the bard or the poet of personality. The fact that he uses the word bard here, by the way, will take us obviously back to our Chaucer, even further back to our Beowulf. In other words, it's that ancient tradition of the bard as singer, as scop, right? That bringer of the story. And, he says, I will show, notice we're going to begin with several of these shows, these demonstrations. I will show of male and female. We're back to passage 11, and of course the songbird, the she-bird, the he-bird, right? I will show of male and female, but that either is but the equal of the other. Whoa! So already we're seeing some lines that are quite radical for Whitman's day. But of course he's borrowing heavily from Plato's Republic, and of course what we call in Book 5 those three waves. You will remember those three waves, where one of those three waves is women ought to be able to rule and therefore be educated just like men because they are co-equals with men. It was a pretty radical idea for Plato. Obviously it was a radical idea for Whitman as well, right? He says, and, we're really going to get now to the heart of the matter, sexual organs and acts, and he puts an exclamation point there. Whitman, of course, very, very iconoclastic. Whoa, what did we just read? This is the reason why. So many readers of Leaves of Grass early on in the deathbed edition picked this volume up and said, it is pornography, it is obscene, it shouldn't be read, certainly shouldn't be read by guys like you school kids and the like. But notice here, he'll say, I'm going to talk about sexual organs and I'm even going to talk about sexual acts. Again, this is a very radical idea. And then he says, do you concentrate in me? For both of them, in other words, will be concentrated in Whitman's Leaves of Grass. For I am determined, notice again the elided verb, to tell you with courageous, clear voice. This courageous and clear, Whitman doesn't want to be mistaken at all here, to prove you illustrious. Now, two observations. Notice the word prove here is, we're back to this idea of the test, which I think in many ways takes us back to the Gettysburg Address. I think Whitman loved Lincoln so much, and he loved the Gettysburg Address so much. And Lincoln's notion that everything was a test at this point to see whether that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. The other thing I should point out is that this line was actually transferred to its present position in 1871. It first was in passage number 6, which again makes some sense given that we're comparing the two sections to each other. And he continues, and I will show that there is no imperfection in the present. This will take us to Burns in our study of To a Mouse, and the idea is that the plow is always coming. The mouse has the capacity to run off as soon as his house has been jacked and start building his new house. Why? Because he only lives in the present. And here we're going to have Whitman playing around with this idea of the ability to live in the present. He says, I will show, he says, there is no imperfection in the present and can be none in the future. No imperfection means hope-filled. Everything is going to, in his theodicy, point towards the propedeutic, instructional, didactic. And I will show that whatever happens to anybody, it may be turned, notice the elided verb, to beautiful results. And there it is. That's Whitman's theodicy in a heartbeat, in one line. When bad things happen, don't ask why did this happen to me, but rather why did this happen for me. This is Whitman's theodicy. Now, of course, we could argue, well, yeah, but I mean, look, he probably had a great life, and that's why he can say everything turns out so great to these amazing and beautiful results. But in fact, Whitman as person, we find that in fact quite the opposite is true. I mean, I mentioned already his years as a nurse in the Civil War and the horror that he saw there, but he was convinced in his optimistic idealism everything can be made to somehow find its way to beautiful results. And then he continues with a weaving metaphor, which of course is part of our study of the Odyssey. You'll remember that Penelope will put off her suitors by weaving and unweaving. This idea of weaving or constructing is central to how we will as well want to read Leaves of Grass, the leaving and the weaving that will be a part of this. And I will show that nothing can happen more beautiful than death. Now, this is such a compelling idea, and it's a mnemonic that will work for us here, if you would like. We are now going to jump really quickly to passage 6 of Song of Myself, and the very last lines, speaking, of course, of death. And all goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Look at this again, this line, I will show that nothing can happen more beautiful than death. And I will thread a thread through my poems that time and events are compact, everything is connected, right? Everything has its place. And that all of the things of the universe are perfect miracles. We'll come back to this idea in passage 48 of Song of Myself. To glance with an eye or show a bean in its pond confounds the learning of all time will be the way he says it there. Each as profound as any. And let's pause for a moment and just point out what it is that he's saying here. Even the great dragon at the end of Beowulf, that will ultimately take down the great warrior Beowulf, that is to say, the worst of imagined metaphysical evils, death itself, even death is beautiful. Because, as T.S. Eliot will say in his East Coker, in my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning. The first and the last poems of that classic poem. And of course we've given full lectures on all of that. You can go back and see, and I believe, the ways in which Whitman, very influential for T.S. Eliot in the writing of Four Quartets, the idea that everything that happens that seems to be evil or bad can in fact be understood as resulting in something quite, he says it twice, right? Beautiful. That is to say, useful, we might say, right? To finish now, I will not, now he's going to start to talk about what he will not do, and I think he learned a lot of this not construction, N-O-T construction, from his study of Shakespeare, who of course he adored. Shakespeare's sonnet 116, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, love is not love which alters when an alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it's a never fixed mark, and he's going to play a similar kind of game here. I will not make poems with references to parts. This is his inclusivity, as we've said. I will make poems, songs, thoughts with reference to ensemble. And of course he loves to use his musical language here, right? And I will not sing with reference to a day, but with reference to all days. In other words, Whitman at the same time wants to be specific and universalist, which is why we will argue he becomes such an important poet, because he'll play both sides of that game, right? And, he says, I will not, for the last time, make a poem, nor the least part of a poem, but has reference to the soul. Throughout all of Leaves of Grass, we're playing this game of, yes, there is a body, but there is also something that stands behind the body, or through the body, that will allow then for us to talk about a certain kind of dualism, right? That is to say, there is the body, but there is also the soul or the mind. And he's fascinated by that, and he's always wanting to come back to that. If you will, from our lecture on Eidolons, when we referenced our Plato's Republic there, and the idea of the form theory in the two boxes. He's always interested in that second box. Because, having looked, notice the elided verb again, at the objects of the universe, I find there is no one nor any particular of one, but has reference to the soul. Everything will come back to this idea of the soul. And I think this is what Whitman means when he talks about religion. He's not just talking about some, attendance at some worship assembly. He's talking about this awe or reverence that will be given for all of life vis-a-vis the soul. Well, let's finish quickly at 2a. There's so many different messages here. Obviously, great poets will show and not tell, and he will play that game. Obviously, his theodicy is central as well. You got to find the worst imaginable things that can happen, and then through those things, find beautiful results. Can you do that? That will be the challenge for us at 3b, right? At 2b, notice the repeated 13 times at least of I will. The intentionality of Whitman. This is what I intend to do. And of course, saying it over and over again, especially early in the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, is a way to remind us all of what really matters. At 3a, we've mentioned section 6 of both starting from Paumanok as well as Song of Myself. And I want to mention Plato's Phaedo here. We've given a lecture on this one, and Plato's treatment of the soul and how important that is. Finally, 2 questions to finish. Do you agree with Whitman's theodicy that all bad can in fact be turned to beautiful results? Or you are going to argue that that's just silly optimism? And finally, do you believe in the soul? And shall we go on now to passage 13 and Whitman's metaphysics? And we'll come back to the idea of Plato's Phaedo. It should be an exciting next step for us as we're working through Leaves of Grass. Thank you.